Washington, D.C., October 1943. The city was a fortress of polished stone and quiet panic, a place where decisions that could shorten the war or doom a million men were made behind oak doors. Tonight, one of those doors was open. A Georgian mansion on Massachusetts Avenue blazed with light, a beacon of false normalcy. The war was in the champagne bubbles and the strained laughter, in the way military men stood a little too straight and the diplomat's eyes flickered a little too often towards the doors. Among them, a man moved with the quiet assurance of a deep-water current. Andrei Volkov, deputy military attaché of the Soviet embassy. To the casual observer, he was a slightly austere, impeccably polite fixture of the Allied diplomatic circuit. He spoke English with the faint, unplaceable accent of a European educated everywhere and nowhere. He listened more than he talked. His smiles were rare, small, and always reached his cold blue eyes a fraction of a second later than his lips. He was conducting a symphony of perception. His focus was a U.S. Navy logistics officer, a Commander Briggs, whose uniform seemed to hang on him a size too large. The man had the hollowed-out look of someone carrying a secret too heavy for his rank. Volkov had not approached him directly. That was amateurish. Instead, he had positioned himself within earshot of Briggs's conversation with a boorish congressman, absorbing snippets about port capacities and transport schedules. Then, with the congressman called away, Volkov had smoothly filled the space, not as a predator, but as a fellow island of quiet in a noisy sea. He offered a silver case. Briggs took a cigarette. The lighter flame flared, illuminating for a second the deep lines of exhaustion on the American's face and the calm, analytic planes of Volkov's. "The convoys," Volkov said, his voice low, almost conspiratorial, yet devoid of actual warmth. A brutal arithmetic. Tons delivered against tons lost. "It must keep you awake, the equation." It was not a question, but a statement of shared burden. Briggs exhaled smoke, a sigh disguised. "You have no idea. It's not just the U-boats, it's the steel. The bearings in the engine rooms are grinding themselves to dust from constant high-speed runs. We're eating our own machinery." Volkov nodded slowly, as if absorbing a profound philosophical truth, not a critical vulnerability in Allied shipping. His mind, a vault of such details, recorded the numbers Briggs murmured next: specific alloy grades, tolerance thresholds, failure rates. Each digit was a gold coin in the economy of war. A burst of laughter from across the room made Briggs flinch, a man jumpy from too much coffee and too little sleep. Volkov's hand, steady as a surgeon's, came to rest briefly on the man's elbow. A gesture of solidarity, a human connection. In that touch, Volkov transmitted calm and extracted the final crucial piece, the name of the primary subcontractor for those failing bearings, a company in Pittsburgh. "We all bear our weight, Commander," Volkov said, releasing his arm. "Thank you for the conversation and for your work." He melted back into the crowd, leaving Briggs strangely comforted, having shared a burden without realizing he had handed over a weapon. The ritual of extraction was next. Volkov made his way to the men's lounge, a sanctuary of dark wood and leather. It was empty. He entered a stall, locked the door, and the last vestige of Andrei Volkov, the diplomat, evaporated. What remained was a consciousness of pure function. From a hidden compartment in his belt, he produced a sliver of film no larger than a grain of rice and a vial of adhesive. Using a miniature tool that looked like a needle, he placed the microdot onto a predetermined period on a page of a Washington Post Society column he carried. The action took less than 15 seconds. His breathing remained even. Then, the touchstone. From the specially reinforced lapel of his jacket, he extracted not a pin, but a small sealed glass ampule. It was dark brown, opaque, cyanide. It was not for dramatic last stands. It was a logical exit strategy, the final guarantor of silence. His thumb stroked the cool glass once, a lover's caress to his own mortality. It was a reminder of the absolute value of the information now hidden in the newspaper, and the absolute consequence of failure. He returned the ampule to its silk-lined prison. The mask of Volkov reassembled itself in his eyes. He exited the lounge, his mission complete, a ghost once more in a world of solid, worried men. The crisp night air was a relief. His embassy car, a black Packard, waited at the curb. His driver, a sullen man named Pavel, nodded as he slid into the back seat. The door thudded shut, a sound of perfect insulation. As the car pulled away from the glittering facade of the mansion, Volkov allowed himself a single, deep breath. The information was secure. The operation was clean. They were 2 blocks away, turning onto a quieter, tree-lined street when it happened. A garbage truck, a hulking, noisy beast, was clumsily reversing from an alley, its path blocked by a parked delivery van. Their Packard was forced to a halt. Pavel muttered a curse in Russian and tapped the horn. The scene was one of mundane urban frustration. Volkov watched, initially detached. Then his instincts, sharper than any blade, fired a warning. The garbage collectors, 2 burly men in overalls, were not arguing with the van driver. They were moving with a coordinated, deliberate slowness. One pretended to examine a tire. The other was looking not at the van, but directly at the idling Packard. His gaze swept over the license plate, the model, the opaque windows. It was a look of assessment, not curiosity. At that exact moment, a light came on in a second-story window of a townhouse beside them. A woman appeared, silhouetted against the yellow glow. She held a telephone to her ear, but she was looking down directly at the stalled traffic. Her posture was not one of casual observation. It was stiff, attentive. A cold trickle, pure adrenaline, traced Volkov's spine. This was not a coincidence. This was a tableau. The blocked street, the observing workman, the woman in the window. It was too neat, too staged. It was a box. A passive, non-confrontational trap designed to force a pause, to observe, to record. Pavel, sensing his passenger's sudden stillness, glanced in the mirror. "Comrade?" "Do nothing," Volkov said, his voice a low hum. "Wait." His eyes, like cameras, panned the scene. He saw it then, mounted on a utility pole across the street. A new, boxy housing with a dark glass eye. A camera, not common then. An experiment. Or a targeted installation. The logjam cleared. The garbage truck lurched forward. The workman did not look back. The light in the townhouse window went out. "Proceed," Volkov said. "Normal speed." As the Packard rolled forward, Volkov did not look at the camera. He looked at the reflection of his own face in the tinted window. The calm was still there, but beneath it, in the set of his jaw and the slight narrowing of his eyes, was a new, ice-cold fury. Not fear. Fury. His perfect, invisible maneuver had been witnessed. His car, his face behind glass, his presence on this street at this exact time, all now logged in some file, connected to the stalled truck, the watching woman. It was a pinprick of light on a dark map, and someone had just placed it on him. The rest of the ride was silent. The fury metabolized inside him into a diamond-hard focus. Back in the soundproofed silence of his embassy office, he performed the final act. Under the green glow of a desk lamp, he prepared the coded message, embedding the bearing specifications from Commander Briggs, within a tedious report on Lend-Lease tractor deliveries. It was a masterpiece of banality. As he sealed the envelope, a secure courier entered, placing a single sheet of decrypted paper on his desk. The usual traffic. Then, at the bottom, a new priority designator, and a single stark code name burning up from the page. Enormos. Volkov did not move. He stared at the word. The petty incident with the truck, the camera, the watching eyes, it all snapped into a terrifying new context. They were not watching the diplomat. They were beginning to sense the ghost. And now the ghost was being sent to hunt the biggest prey in history. The edge of the razor he walked had just become infinitely sharper. The game was no longer just about gathering secrets. It was about surviving the gathering attention. He was no longer just a collector. He was a target being moved into the crosshairs of a different, darker war. The silence in the room was no longer peaceful. It was the silence before the detonation. The incident on the street did not leave Andrei Volkov. It fossilized inside him, a layer of permanent alertness beneath his diplomatic polish. Washington was no longer just a field of operation. It was a chessboard where he had felt, for the first time, the heat of a light he could not see. The following days were an exercise in calibrated paranoia. He varied his routes to and from the embassy. He took note of recurring faces in different neighborhoods. A mailman who seemed to linger, a woman with a distinctive red hat seen outside 3 different cafes. They might be nothing. They might be everything. The uncertainty was the point. A psychological warfare waged on a single mind. His response was not to hide, but to sculpt a more elaborate, more visible persona. He became a man of predictable public habits. He visited the Library of Congress twice a week, always requesting obscure 19th century European agricultural journals. He spent hours in the reading room, a picture of scholarly immersion, while his peripheral vision mapped every entrance, every reader who shifted in their seat too often. He cultivated a visible, harmless passion for rare first editions, engaging a local bookseller in long, tedious conversations about paper quality and binding techniques. He wanted the FBI, if they were watching, to see a diligent, slightly boring bureaucrat with a quirky intellectual hobby. The real work existed in the negative space of this performance. The microdot from Commander Briggs had yielded a valuable lead, the Pittsburgh bearing manufacturer. Through a cutout, a Swedish maritime insurance broker with socialist leanings and a gambling debt, Volkov made contact with a mid-level plant manager. The approach was indirect, a dance of ideological kinship and veiled financial incentive. It was slow, patient cultivation. The goal was not the man himself, but his access to quality control reports and shipment manifests that would reveal which alloys were failing, and by extension, which new ones were being tested for warships, and potentially for other, more secretive projects. While Volkov built his network of shadows, a parallel construction was taking place across town in the labyrinthine corridors of the Justice Department. Special Agent Robert Pierce's office was a testament to a new kind of warfare. It was small, cramped, and dominated not by filing cabinets, but by a large corkboard that spanned one entire wall. On it was not a map of known criminals, but a web of associations. Photographs of Soviet embassy personnel, grainy and taken from a distance, were pinned in a cluster. In the center was a newer, slightly clearer photo of Andrei Volkov exiting the Georgian mansion on the night of the party. Pierce was 30, but his eyes were older. He had a mathematician's mind trapped in a G-man's body. While his superiors focused on chasing known communists and union organizers, Pierce was obsessed with patterns, with the noise in the system. The Volkov file was his private obsession, a project he worked on after hours, met with polite skepticism by his section chief. The incident with the garbage truck was the catalyst. The report from the surveillance team, a routine log of diplomatic movements, had contained a seemingly mundane detail. Subject's vehicle, Embassy Plate CD-212, impeded for approximately 2 minutes due to a service vehicle blockage on Q Street. No contact made. But Pierce had cross-referenced it with other logs. He had a list of routine impediments involving Soviet personnel, a fender bender near a cafe frequented by a cipher clerk, a fire hydrant burst that forced a resident's car onto a different route, a street sweeper that seemed to always be active outside a suspected dead drop location. Individually, they were nothing. Together they formed a faint, unsettling pattern. They were stress tests, gentle prods to see how the organism reacted. His eyes kept returning to the photo of Volkov. The man's file was sterile, career military attach, impeccable service record, fluent in 4 languages, a widower, tragic car accident, 1938. Too impeccable. It was the lack of texture that screamed at Pierce. A real person had inconsistencies, quirks, failures. Volkov had a void where his personality should be. Pierce began building his own portrait, not from files, but from absences. He studied the transcripts of embassy phone taps. Fruitless. They used codes or banalities. He read the reports from the teams tailing Volkov on his cultural outings. The visits to the library were noted. The bookshop conversations were logged. Pierce read the bookseller's debriefing. The man described Volkov as knowledgeable, polite, a true connoisseur. But one offhand remark caught Pierce's eye. He asked about the acidity of paper pulp in 1880s Lion editions, a remarkably specific technical question for a diplomatic man. A diplomat. Asking precise technical questions about an unrelated field, a mind trained for minutiae. The connection, when it came, was not a thunderclap, but a slow, cold drip. Pierce had requisitioned the guest list from the night of the mansion party. He cross-referenced every name with other departments. When he saw Commander Briggs's name and Briggs's area of logistics, a wire tripped in his brain. He pulled the logistics officer's file. It was clean. But Pierce had a friend in naval intelligence, a discreet, unofficial inquiry. His friend came back with a single guarded sentence. Briggs is involved in materials stress testing for high RPM applications. Sensitive. Materials. Stress testing. Volkov, the man with the void for a personality, had been in proximity to a man with sensitive knowledge about material failure. And now Volkov was suddenly an expert on 19th century paper chemistry. It was a thread, gossamer thin, but it was his thread. Pierce made a decision that would breach protocol. He couldn't put a full tail on Briggs. That required higher authorization he wouldn't get. Instead, he focused on the environment. He had the area around the Navy building casually observed. He requested a log of Briggs's phone calls, a risky move that could get him flagged. Days later, a report landed on his desk. A single, brief outgoing call from Briggs's office line to a number registered to a boutique maritime insurance firm in New York. The Swedish broker. The call lasted 2 minutes. The broker's line, Pierce discovered after more digging, had received a call from a DC payphone 2 days prior. The location of the payphone was 3 blocks from the Soviet embassy. A triangle. Briggs to broker. Broker to a shadow near the embassy. And at the apex, unseen but implied, was the man with the glacial eyes and the interest in paper pulp. Pierce stood before his corkboard. He took a red pin, the color of warning, and pressed it into the center of Volkov's photograph. It was an accusation, a declaration of war fought in silent deductions. He then took a length of red string. He tied one end to the red pin on Volkov's face. He stretched the other end to a blank space on the board, a space he had mentally labeled enormous. The Manhattan Project's security was a fortress beyond his clearance, but the pattern of interest was clear. They were hunting big game, and a hunter, no matter how careful, leaves tracks in the soft earth around the perimeter. That evening, Volkov left the embassy late. He walked the 6 blocks to his rented townhouse, a man enjoying the evening air. He could feel it. The texture of the surveillance had changed. Before, it had been a generic, bureaucratic gaze. Now it felt specific, inquisitive. He spotted the car, a gray Chevrolet sedan, 2 blocks back. It was too careful, too patient. It was not just logging his movements, it was studying them. He did not change his pace. He did not look back. But inside, the machinery of his mind shifted to a new, more dangerous gear. The hunter had been scented by another predator. The game was no longer about simply acquiring secrets. It was a duel of intellect, of pattern against counter-pattern, in the twilight streets of a city that believed itself at peace. The razor's edge now had a name, and Volkov knew, with a cold certainty, that Robert Pierce was beginning to trace its outline in the dark. A gust of Moscow air, sharp with the promise of winter, arrived at Washington's Union Station in the form of Irina Sokolova. She was 26, her beauty not soft, but architectural, high cheekbones, a severe mouth, eyes the color of wet slate that missed nothing. Her papers identified her as a junior communications assistant for the TASS news agency, attached to the embassy. Her manner was correct, efficient, and as warm as a cipher machine. Andrei Volkov met her on the platform, a formality. He saw her before she saw him, observing how she took in the cavernous station, not with wonder but with a swift, analytical assessment of exits, sightlines, potential threats. A professional. He felt a flicker of grim recognition. They were the same species. "Comrade Sokolova, welcome to Washington," he said, his voice flat, carrying no inflection of welcome. "Comrade Volkov, thank you for meeting me," she replied, her Russian crisp, her handshake brief and firm. Her gaze held his for a second too long, a silent probe. She was not just assessing her new surroundings, she was assessing him. In the car back to the embassy compound, the silence was dense. Volkov understood her purpose instantly. The center was tightening its grip. A new cipher clerk, especially one with this aura of quiet competence, was both a resource and an auditor. She was there to facilitate his work and to report on his methods, his state of mind. The Pittsburgh Channel was bearing fruit, but it was slow. Moscow's patience, measured in the relentless ticks of the nuclear clock, was wearing thin. Irina was both the lubricant and the gauge. He integrated her with clinical precision. She was given a small, soundproofed room adjacent to the communications hub. Her duties were to encode his most sensitive field reports and decode the streams of instruction from Moscow. Their interactions were stripped of humanity, exchanges of flimsy paper, nods of acknowledgement, the sterile language of tradecraft. He used her as a component in his machine. Yet the human variable proved impossible to entirely suppress. Volkov, as part of his cover, needed a social life. A solitary diplomat was a suspicious diplomat. He began to include Irina in his curated public appearances. A gallery opening, a symphony, a diplomatic reception. She played her part flawlessly, the intelligent, somewhat reserved junior colleague. In public, he was courteous, slightly avuncular. In the silence of the embassy car afterwards, they would sit in wordless understanding, both decompressing from the performance. One such evening, returning from a tedious cocktail party, their car was stopped at a police checkpoint, a routine search for a reported stolen vehicle. Flashlights played over the interior. An American policeman, young and overzealous, shone his light directly into Irina's face, then Volkov's, demanding their papers. It was a small power play, a minor humiliation. Volkov remained impassive, handing over his diplomatic passport, but he saw Irina's hand, resting on her clutch, tighten until the knuckles were white. It was not fear of exposure. It was a furious, controlled resentment at the violation. In that shared, silent moment of petty oppression, a bridge of understanding was built between them. They were not just operatives, they were foreigners in a hostile land, their dignity a fragile construct. The next day, in the secure room, he handed her a report for encryption. Their fingers brushed. A static charge, or something else, passed between them. He looked up. Her slate-gray eyes held not the blankness of a cipher clerk, but a profound, weary intelligence. For the first time, he spoke to her not as a tool, but as a person. The policeman last night. An inconvenience. A reminder. She corrected softly, her voice barely above a whisper. That we are always guests here, and unwelcome ones. It was more than a complaint. It was a confession of shared isolation. Meanwhile, Robert Pierce was weaving his net tighter. The Swedish broker in New York had been placed under loose surveillance. Pierce, operating on instinct and borrowed authority, had also begun monitoring the flow of people in and out of the building that housed the broker's office. A photograph landed on his desk, taken with a telephoto lens from a nearby rooftop. It showed a man in an overcoat and hat exiting the building. The quality was poor, but the height, the slight stoop of the shoulders, it matched one of the known Soviet couriers from the D.C. Residentura. The triangle was solidifying. Briggs to broker, broker to courier, courier to embassy. And at the embassy, Volkov. But Pierce needed more. He needed to understand the pressure points, the architecture of this invisible apparatus. He turned his attention to the new element, Irina Sokolova. Her file was even thinner than Volkov's. TASS assistant. Clean. Too clean. He studied the surveillance photos of her with Volkov. He was a master of disguise, but she... Pierce looked for the small tells. In one photo taken at the National Gallery, Volkov was examining a painting, but Irina was not looking at the art. Her body was angled slightly away, her eyes scanning the room, the other patrons. She was not a passive companion. She was a lookout. A plan, audacious and dangerous, began to form in Pierce's mind. He couldn't crack Volkov directly. The man was a fortress. But the woman, she was younger, newer to the pressure cooker. She might be the flaw in the crystal. He authorized a new layer of surveillance on Irina, separate from the general embassy watch. He wanted to know her routines, her solitary habits. He discovered she sometimes took a walk alone on Sunday mornings in a small park near the embassy, always with a book, always on the same bench, a tiny pocket of personal space in her regimented life. Pierce decided he would not confront her there. Not yet. But he would observe. He needed to see her when she thought she was truly alone, to read the person behind the professional mask. He needed to find the crack before he could drive in the wedge. Back at the embassy, Volkov received a new directive from Moscow, decrypted by Irina's hands. It was no longer a request, it was a demand. The Pittsburgh channel was useful, but peripheral. The center's focus was now exclusively on enormas. They required a breakthrough, a source within the administrative or scientific hierarchy of the project. The message ended with a chilling, non-technical phrase. All windows are closing. Winter is coming for the world. He read it in his office, the single lamp casting a pool of light in the oceanic dark. The pressure was now a physical weight. He was a master of patience, but Moscow was ruled by panic. He knew that reckless moves in this hunt would get him burned. He needed clarity. He needed a second mind he could trust. Almost without conscious decision, he found himself walking to the secure communications room. It was late. The embassy was a tomb. Irina was still there, meticulously filing transmission logs. She looked up, surprised to see him. He did not speak immediately. He placed the decoded directive on the table between them. He watched her read it, watched the understanding darken her eyes. She saw the same abyss he did. "They are asking for miracles," she finally said, her voice hollow. "They are asking for the only thing that matters now," he replied. Then he did something unprecedented. He pulled out a second sheet of paper, not from Moscow, but his own handwritten notes, a maze of names, institutions, and tenuous connections related to the atomic project. A map of his desperation. "I cannot see the pattern alone," he said, the admission costing him more than any physical risk. Irina looked from the notes to his face. In his eyes she did not see the unflappable Neligal. She saw a man bearing the weight of a coming cataclysm, isolated on all sides. The wall between operative and auditor, between suspicion and solidarity, crumbled in that silent, charged moment. She pulled her chair closer to the table. Not a word of agreement was spoken. None was needed. Together, under the single weak bulb, Hunter and Watchman became partners, their heads bent over the blueprint of the impossible. While outside, in the sleeping city, Robert Pierce studied photographs of her solitary walks, searching for the key to break them both. The fragile alliance between Volkov and Irina became the new axis of his world. Their collaboration was conducted in the silent hours of the night, within the concrete womb of the embassy's most secure room. It was a fusion of minds, his fieldcraft and patient instinct against her brilliant, analytical capacity for pattern recognition. She cross-referenced his handwritten web of contacts with publicly available scientific directories, university alumni lists, and society pages. She was not looking for a top physicist. Those were locked away behind a wall of secrecy and armed guards. She was searching for a seam, an administrator, a procurement officer, a secretary with access, and a vulnerability. They found it in the periphery of the radiation. His name was Dr. Felix Brewer, a metallurgist of some renown, who had, according to a footnote in an old academic journal, consulted for the University of Chicago's metallurgical laboratory years earlier. The Met Lab was the cradle, the theoretical heart that had fed the engineering beast of Enormaz. Brewer was now in his late 50s, working in a private research firm in upstate New York, seemingly disconnected from the war effort. But Irina, cross-referencing travel manifests and discreetly intercepted personal correspondence, discovered a pattern. Brewer's elderly sister, his only family, was dying of a rare blood disease in a private clinic in Baltimore. The treatment was experimental, ruinously expensive, and failing. Brewer made frantic weekly trips south, a man being slowly bankrupted by despair. Here was the seam. Not ideology, not greed, but love and desperation. A vulnerability more powerful than any political conviction. Volkov knew the approach had to be perfect. Brewer was a patriot, a man of science. A direct offer of money for secrets would disgust him, alert him. The manipulation had to be a masterpiece of psychological engineering. Volkov would not offer a bribe. He would offer a miracle. Using the Swedish broker as an unwitting cutout once more, Volkov had a message delivered to Brewer's hotel in Baltimore. It was not from a Soviet agent. It was purportedly from a European medical foundation, aware of his sister's unique condition, conducting parallel research in Switzerland. They offered, out of scientific camaraderie and a desire for transatlantic collaboration, to provide a sample of a new, promising synthetic coagulant, at no cost, for experimental use only. The hook was not money, but hope. The only requirement was a preliminary meeting with their logistics representative to discuss shipping protocols and medical histories. Brewer, clutching at any straw, agreed to meet the representative in a neutral public space, the Great Hall of the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History, by the massive African elephant display. A place of overwhelming crowds and echoing noise, perfect for a clandestine meeting. The plan was set, but the atmosphere in Washington had turned to ice. The surveillance on Volkov was no longer a discreet shadow. It was a presence. The gray Chevrolet was now a constant. Different agents, but the same focused intent. Robert Pierce was tightening the vise, waiting for a mistake. Volkov knew the meeting in the museum was a colossal risk. He would have to evade the tail, disappear into the city, make the contact, and return, all within a plausible window of time. It was a high-wire act over an abyss. The day of the meeting dawned cold and bright. Volkov left the embassy at his usual time, heading for his weekly visit to the Library of Congress. The gray Chevrolet fell in behind him. He entered the library's majestic reading room, feeling the weight of watching eyes. He requested his usual stack of agricultural journals and took his customary seat. He waited, a statue of scholarly focus, for 90 minutes. Then he executed his move. He gathered his papers and walked not towards the exit, but deeper into the library, towards the restricted manuscript rooms and staff corridors. He had, over previous visits, identified a little used service staircase that led down to a basement receiving area, and from there, a delivery entrance that opened onto a side alley. It was a gamble. If the FBI had men covering all exits, he was finished. His heart was a cold, hard drum in his chest as he pushed through the heavy metal door into the alley. The shock of daylight and cold air was visceral. He did not run. He turned up his collar, adjusted his hat, and merged into the flow of pedestrians on the street. a man transformed from a diplomat into just another city dweller. He took a circuitous route, using shop windows as mirrors, boarding and alighting from streetcars at random stops. The familiar, exhilarating clarity of fieldcraft took over. He was a ghost again. At the Smithsonian, the noise was a tangible force. Schoolchildren shrieked, tourists gaped, the dusty smell of history filled the air. Volkov spotted Dr. Brewer immediately. The man stood under the elephant's towering skeleton, a small, shrunken figure clutching a briefcase, his eyes scanning the crowd with nervous hope, not tradecraft paranoia. Volkov approached from the side, not making eye contact, positioning himself as if admiring the same exhibit. "The magnitude of the creature is humbling," Volkov said, his voice low, his accent vaguely Scandinavian, matching the cover of the Medical Foundation. "It reminds one that even giants are brought down by the smallest of failures in their system." Brewer started, then looked at him. Volkov saw the raw anguish in the man's eyes, the desperate need to believe in the miracle being offered. The sample?" Brewer whispered. "The paperwork is being prepared in Geneva, but for the shipping we require assurances of stability. The treatment is sensitive to certain ambient radiation levels. Could your sister's environment have any unusual exposure risks?" It was the key question, masked in medical concern. A question about background radiation near her clinic, which could, in the answer, reveal if Brewer still had any access to or knowledge of radioactive materials from his past work. Brewer, eager to prove his sister's eligibility for the fake treatment, began to speak in hushed, technical terms about safe thresholds, mentioning comparative readings he'd taken years prior at the Met Lab. He spoke of containment protocols, of graphite moderators. He was giving Volkov the confirmation he needed. Brewer's knowledge was not just historical. It was detailed, current, and deeply ingrained. He was a viable source. Volkov provided the next set of instructions: a dead-drop location for future communication, a hollowed-out rock in a specific park in Baltimore, near the clinic. No more direct meetings. The promise of the coagulant would be the leash. As he was about to melt away, Brewer grabbed his arm, a gesture of pathetic strength. "You swear it will help her?" Volkov met the man's desperate gaze. For a fraction of a second, the professional ice within him cracked, revealing the bleak understanding of the cruel play he was orchestrating. He was weaponizing a dying woman. "We are all searching for miracles, Doctor," he said, the truth hidden in the ambiguity. He pulled his arm away and vanished into the swirling crowd, leaving Brewer alone under the bones of the extinct giant. The exfiltration was even more dangerous. He had to return to the library, to re-emerge from the same building he had entered, completing the illusion of an uninterrupted study session. He reversed his route, his senses screaming, every stranger a potential agent. He slipped back into the library basement, up the service stairs, and into the quiet sanctum of the reading room. He sat back down at his desk, his agricultural journal open, his breathing steady. He had been gone for 2 hours and 17 minutes. A long bathroom break, perhaps. A lunch retrieved from a briefcase. Plausible, but thin. As he gathered his things to leave, he felt the gaze. He looked up slowly across the vast room. Standing by the main entrance, not looking at any book, but directly at him, was a man in a trench coat. It was not one of the usual surveillance faces. It was Robert Pierce. Pierce did not smile, did not nod. He simply stood there, making his presence known, making it clear that the ghost had been seen slipping through the cracks. Their eyes locked across the hushed space filled with knowledge. It was not an accusation with evidence. It was a statement of intent, a declaration that the hunt was now personal, and the hunter was no longer lurking in the shadows, but standing in the light, waiting for him. Volkov held the gaze for a 3 count, then looked down, calmly stacking his papers. The meeting with Brewer was a success. He had his source, but the cost was now apparent. He had stepped into the light to grab his prize, and in doing so, had etched his silhouette perfectly against the sky for his enemy to see. The razor's edge had just become a beam of light, and he was dancing at its very center. The silent confrontation in the library echoed in Volkov's mind like a tolling bell. Robert Pierce had shifted the paradigm. This was no longer a passive surveillance game. It was an active, intelligent pursuit. The pressure was no longer an atmospheric condition. It was a boot heel pressing down on his windpipe. Every move now had to be calculated against the brilliant, cold lens of Pierce's deduction. The Baltimore dead drop was activated. Using Arena to craft messages that were masterpieces of empathetic manipulation, pleas from the Swiss Foundation for more clinical data to tailor the treatment, Volkov began to extract information from Dr. Brewer. The material came in fragments, scribbled on notepaper, and tucked into the hollow rock. Recalled schematics of early reactor cooling systems, the names of former colleagues who had vanished into the New Mexico desert, speculative equations about critical mass. It was piecemeal, a jigsaw puzzle of a weapon, but each piece was a revelation. Irina would decode, collate, and synthesize the data into coherent reports for Moscow. The center's responses grew warmer, their demands more urgent. They could smell the proximity of the secret. This shared, crushing responsibility forged Volkov and Irina's partnership into something more profound, more dangerous. The secure room became their entire world. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead as they worked, their shoulders almost touching. The air grew thick with the scent of paper, ink, and their shared, unspoken tension. One night, after a particularly brutal directive from Moscow demanding impossible specifics on explosive lens design, Irina's composure cracked. She didn't cry. Instead, she began to speak in a low, monotone voice, her eyes fixed on the blank wall. She told him about her brother, Alexei, a brilliant engineer, not a politician. He had made an offhand joke about a faulty tractor design at a factory meeting in 1937. The joke was deemed sabotage, a whisper against Soviet progress. He was taken in the night. She described the sound of boots on the staircase, her mother's silent, trembling hand over her own mouth. They received a postcard 6 months later from a timber camp in Siberia. Then, nothing. I joined the service not out of love for it, she said, the words leaving her like stones dropped into a well. I joined to understand the machine that took him, to see its gears from the inside. Volkov listened, a statue coming to life. Her confession was an act of monumental trust, a grenade with the pin pulled, placed in his hands. In return, he did not offer a story of his own. His past was a locked archive. Instead, he offered a truth of the present. He slid across the table not a report, but the latest, most chilling demand from Moscow. A direct order to pressure Brewer for the physical location of the primary enrichment facility. An order that would inevitably break the fragile doctor and trigger security alarms. They are not just asking for secrets, Volkov said, his voice gravelly with fatigue. "They are asking us to burn the source, to end the intelligence for a single, possibly incomplete datum. It is not tradecraft. It is panic." Irina looked from the order to his face, seeing not the Neligal, but a man standing at a crossroads, his professional loyalty warring with a dawning, more humane calculus. "And what do we do?" she asked, the we hanging between them, solid and real. "We walk to the edge of the cliff," he replied, "and then we decide if the order is worth the jump." It was that night, in the exhausted, raw silence after their conversation, that the professional barrier dissolved entirely. It was not a moment of passion, but of profound, desolate need. A touch on the hand became an anchor. A meeting of eyes became a sanctuary. In the grim, soundproofed room, surrounded by the ghosts of stolen secrets and a stolen brother, they found a sliver of truth in each other. It was a rebellion against the machine that used them, a silent pact, forged not in ideology, but in shared bone-deep isolation. For the first time, Volkov had something to lose that was not a mission parameter. He had a partner. This personal earthquake made Volkov hyper-aware of the external threat. He knew Pierce would be focusing on Irina, the perceived weaker link. He doubled their operational security. They communicated through a private system of book codes, using a shared, mundane volume of 19th century poetry from the library. Their affection was hidden in plain sight, disguised as collegiality during rare public moments. The strain was immense, a constant, low-grade fever of alertness. Pierce, meanwhile, was indeed zeroing in. He had bypassed his superiors entirely, using personal favors and bureaucratic sleight of hand to deepen the surveillance on Irina. He discovered her Sunday walks in the park. Through high-powered lenses, he studied her face as she read. He saw not the blank cipher clerk, but a young woman of intense, somber intelligence. He saw the weight she carried. He also noted, with forensic interest, a new detail. On 2 consecutive Sundays, the book in her hand was the same, a thick, dark-bound volume. He had an agent casually pass her bench and identify the title, The Collected Works of Lord Byron. An odd, romantic choice for a Soviet communications assistant. A break came from a different angle. The FBI's technical squad, working on the Venona project, had painstakingly begun to crack the edges of Soviet diplomatic code. It was a glacial, uncertain process, but they intercepted a fragment. A message from the DC Residentura to Moscow, partially decrypted. It mentioned a source codenamed Thistle and the phrase, "Pressure regarding primary site unsustainable. Request authorization for..." The rest was garbled. Thistle. It wasn't Volkov. It wasn't Irina. It was an asset. Pierce's mind raced. He cross-referenced every person of interest in the Volkov orbit. The Swedish broker? No. He pulled Brewer's file. The man was a blip, a private sector scientist with a sick sister. But the sister was in Baltimore. And Baltimore was where the courier to the broker had gone. A circuit connected in Pierce's mind, a flash of lightning illuminating the landscape. He didn't have proof. He had a pattern. Volkov, the woman Sokolova, a desperate metallurgist in Baltimore, and a partially decrypted cable pressuring for a primary site. Pierce stood before his corkboard, the red string from Volkov, now stretching to a new photograph, a grainy, public database picture of Dr. Felix Brewer, looking haunted, even in a professional portrait. The web was no longer theoretical. It had a name, a face, a dying sister. Pierce understood the leverage. He couldn't arrest Volkov, diplomatic immunity. He couldn't prove anything against Irina. But Brewer was an American citizen, vulnerable, crumbling. He made his decision. He would not confront Brewer yet. To do so would be to show his hand, to potentially scare the Soviets into aborting and leaving him with nothing. Instead, he would tighten the noose around the controllers. He would make their operational environment so toxic, so claustrophobic, that they would make a mistake. He authorized round-the-clock surveillance on Volkov and Irina, not just physical, but electronic. He had microphones aimed at the windows of their embassy apartments from neighboring buildings. He had their trash sifted meticulously. He was building a cage of light and sound around them, waiting for the panicked flutter of wings against the bars. Volkov felt the cage closing. The static in the air became a physical pressure. The gray Chevrolet was now one of 3 rotating vehicles. He spotted watchers on rooftops opposite the embassy. The once abstract game of espionage had crystallized into a simple, brutal race. Could he and Irina assemble the puzzle of Enormaz before Pierce's cage snapped shut? Before Moscow's reckless orders forced their hand? And before the fragile, manipulated soul of Dr. Brewer shattered under the weight of a lie and a dying sister? The personal and the professional had fused into a single, burning point of imminent catastrophe. The shadow they cast now had weight, and it was pulling them into the abyss. The cage Robert Pierce built was not made of iron bars, but of light, sound, and relentless, documented normality. Every departure from the embassy by Volkov or Irina was logged with stopwatch precision. Their trash, meticulously collected and analyzed, told a story of sterile, predictable lives. Orange peels, tea leaves, empty ink cartridges. The microphones trained on their windows captured only the faint, muffled sounds of solitary existence. A radio playing Tchaikovsky, the rustle of pages, the running of a solitary tap. It was a symphony of nothingness, and to Pierce it was the most damning evidence of all. Only professionals, ghosts aware of being hunted, lived with such conscious, surgical quiet. Volkov operated within these constraints like a master of miniature arts. His communication with Brewer became an exercise in exquisite patience. Instructions were no longer left in the Baltimore dead drop. Instead, using a complex system of classified advertisements in the Baltimore Sun, pre-agreed phrases about antique watch repair or rare stamp auctions, he directed Brewer to secondary, tertiary locations. Each transfer of information was a marathon of anti-surveillance routes, of false entries into department stores, and exits through service elevators. The strain etched itself into Volkov's face, carving new lines of permanent vigilance around his eyes. The information from Brewer, however, was escalating in value. They now had rough schematics of gaseous diffusion lattice designs, a cornerstone of uranium enrichment. It was the heart of the beast. It was in this atmosphere of suffocating pressure that the offer arrived. Not from Pierce, but from the abyss. It began with a letter, delivered by standard post to the embassy, addressed to Volkov's diplomatic alias. Inside was a typed note on plain paper, written in awkward formal Russian. It claimed to be from a group of patriots within the apparatus, officers of the NKVD who had seen the deviation and corruption at the highest levels. They spoke of Beria's monstrous excesses, of Stalin's paranoia gutting the motherland's strength from within. They claimed to possess documents, names, dates, orders that could shatter the leadership. They wanted to defect, to hand over this cancer to a man they believed was a true servant of the Soviet ideal, not the Politburo. They proposed a meeting on neutral ground, a secluded bench in the wooded expanse of Rock Creek Park at midnight. Volkov read the letter in his office, the hair on the back of his neck rising. Every instinct screamed provocation. It was too theatrical, too perfectly tailored to the ideological fissures a disillusioned officer might feel. But it was also a siren song of unimaginable magnitude. If it was real, it was the kind of intelligence that could redefine the war, his career, everything. If it was a trap from the Americans, it was crude. If it was a trap from his own side, that was a different, more chilling calculus. He shared the letter with Irina in their secure room. Her face paled as she read it. "It's a test," she whispered, the memory of her brother's fate a ghost in the room. "From the center. They suspect your loyalty, our collaboration. They want to see if you'll bite." Volkov knew she was likely right. The center's paranoia was a legendary, self-consuming fire. His success with Brewer had made him valuable, but also singular, and therefore suspect. His relationship with Irina, however discreet, would not have gone unnoticed. This was a classic loyalty test. Dangle the ultimate betrayal and see if the agent reaches for it. The order came the very next day, via the usual encrypted channel, decoded by Irina's own hands. It was a routine message, but buried within the flow of logistics was a single, seemingly innocuous phrase. "Weather in Moscow suggests a change. Advise carrying an umbrella to the park." It was a prearranged confirmation code, a signal from the center that the defection offer was indeed their operation. A test. His instructions were clear. Play along, meet the defectors, and report back every detail to prove his vigilance. The poison of the situation seeped into Volkov's bones. He was now ordered to participate in his own inquisition, to perform loyalty for auditors who trusted no one. The personal sanctuary he had found with Irina was now the probable cause for this grotesque theater. The operation with Brewer, the very reason for his existence in Washington, was being jeopardized by the petty, all-consuming suspicion of the machine he served. The night of the meeting was moonless, cold enough to fog the breath. Rock Creek Park was a pit of shadows, the sounds of the city distant and muffled. Volkov approached the designated bench, a figure carved from the darkness. He felt, rather than saw, the observers. They would be in the trees, in the parked cars on the distant road, listening, watching. He was an actor on a stage, and his performance would determine his life. Two men emerged from the gloom. They had the correct look, the cheap Soviet suits, the wary, hardened faces of internal security men. They recited their lines with convincing desperation, speaking of purges and lies, handing over a thick envelope of what looked like authentic classified documents. Volkov played his part perfectly. He was the outraged patriot, listening with grim satisfaction, asking precise, probing questions to draw out more details, all the while secretly memorizing their faces, their phrases, for his report. He took the envelope, a dead weight in his hands. The meeting ended with handshakes of grim solidarity, plans for a next contact that would never come. As he walked back to his car, the envelope burning against his chest, a profound and icy disillusionment settled over him. The game had turned inward. The real enemy was not just Pierce's FBI. It was the gnawing, paranoid beast of his own side, a beast that would willingly sabotage its own best instruments in a fit of ideological purity. He had danced on their strings tonight, and the humiliation was a colder fire than any fear of American arrest. He filed his report, a masterpiece of detailed observation, proving his loyalty by dissecting the provocation. The center's response was a simple, new code phrase. Umbrella no longer required. He had passed. He should have felt relief. He felt only a deeper, more fundamental alienation. Pierce, monitoring the park from a discreet distance with a small, trusted team, saw the meeting occur. He didn't understand its internal Soviet context, but he recognized a clandestine handoff. He photographed the two defectors, their faces unknown to his databases. The fact that Volkov was meeting with new, unidentified contacts deep in a park at midnight was a seismic event in Pierce's investigation. It confirmed Volkov was active, that the network was expanding. It also filled Pierce with a frustrated urgency. The cage was tight, but Volkov was still operating within it. And now there were new players. The dual pressures, the external cage of the FBI and the internal straitjacket of the center's suspicion, began to warp Volkov's and Irina's world. Their moments of quiet connection became fraught, each touch a potential liability, each whispered word a possible betrayal if overheard by unseen microphones. The love that had been a sanctuary now felt like another layer of vulnerability, a weakness their enemies, on both sides, could exploit. The final straw came from Moscow. The response to Volkov's latest cautious report on the gaseous diffusion data was not praise. It was a scalding reprimand for his excessive operational timidity. The order was explicit, brutal, and final. Brewer was to be pushed for the physical location of the primary enrichment facility within 72 hours. No more excuses. The phrase used was, "Apply maximum leverage. The asset is expendable in the pursuit of the objective." Volkov read the words, then looked at Irina. In her eyes he saw the reflection of his own grim understanding. Maximum leverage meant threatening the sister, withdrawing the false hope of medicine, destroying the man to get the last piece of data. It was not intelligence work, it was butchery, and it would almost certainly trigger Brewer's collapse and alert American security. The center's test had been about loyalty. Now their order was about conscience. Volkov stood at the precipice. To obey was to complete his mission at the cost of his soul and likely his security. To disobey was to mark himself and Irina as traitors in the eyes of the only power that gave them identity. The poisoned chalice of his success had been handed to him, and he was forced to drink, with Pierce's brilliant, relentless eyes watching every swallow. The fragile alliance of spy and lover now faced an impossible choice: sacrifice the source or sacrifice themselves. The clock, for the first time, was ticking loudly inside their own safe house. The 72-hour ultimatum from Moscow hung in the secure room like a physical presence, a shroud of irradiated dust settling over every surface, every thought. The schematic of the gaseous diffusion lattice lay on the table between Volkov and Irina, a testament to their skill and patience, now rendered a mere stepping stone to an act of professional and moral atrocity. The order to apply maximum leverage and render Brewer expendable was not an operational directive. It was a suicide note for their own humanity and likely for the entire network. Volkov spent the first 24 hours in a state of intense, silent calculation. He mapped scenarios like a chess player facing a forced checkmate. Obeying Moscow meant sending a message to Brewer that would shatter the man. The result would be one of two things: Either Brewer, in his despair, would give them the location and then immediately confess to the FBI, or he would break down and confess immediately. Either way, the alarm would be raised. The FBI, with Pierce's obsessive focus, would descend. The embassy would be surrounded. The diplomatic shield would strain, and he and Irina would be trapped, their usefulness ended, likely recalled to Moscow in disgrace or worse, sacrificed in a diplomatic tit-for-tat. The mission would die, and they would be consumed by the machine they served. Disobeying Moscow meant becoming traitors in a system that had only one punishment for treason. They would be isolated, hunted by both sides, with nowhere to run. The equations always ended in ruin. It was Irina who, on the second night, articulated the unthinkable third variable. Her face was drawn, her slate-gray eyes luminous with a terrifying clarity. She was not looking at the Soviet orders, but at a surveillance photograph Pierce had accidentally given them. A grainy shot of herself on the park bench, taken from a distance. "They watch," she said, her voice steady, "but they do not act. Pierce is a collector. He gathers pieces. He wants the whole picture, not just one broken piece." She turned her gaze to Volkov. "What if we give him a picture, but one we paint?" The idea, born of desperation, was audacious to the point of insanity. A false defection, not a real one. They were Soviets to their marrow, despite their disillusionment. But a controlled play. They would offer themselves to Pierce not as defectors, but as double agents. They would feed him validated, but ultimately sterile intelligence, sacrificing the already compromised Brewer channel to save the deeper possibility of future access. In return, they would demand sanctuary, a blind eye turned to their continued, more careful existence. They would use the FBI's desire to turn them as a shield against Moscow's reckless orders. Volkov stared at her, seeing not his lover, but a strategist of breathtaking, cold courage. The plan was a hall of mirrors. It required perfect deception of both superpowers simultaneously. It required them to betray their country's immediate objective to save its longer-term potential, and to betray America's investigation to save their own lives. It was the ultimate act of a spy, playing both ends against a middle that was only themselves. "Pierce will never trust it," Volkov stated, the flaw glaring. "He will if the intelligence we give him is real and leads to a tangible result," Irina countered. "We give him Brewer. We give him the proof of the approach, the dead drop, the method. We let him capture the network, while we remain as his prized assets, hidden deeper. To Moscow, we will report that Brewer was burned by FBI surveillance, a professional misfortune, not disobedience." The moral cost was staggering. They were condemning Dr. Brewer, a man manipulated by their lie about his sister's salvation. They were sacrificing him on the altar of their own survival. Volkov saw the ghost of Irina's brother, Alexei, in the room. They were becoming the machine that crushed fragile lives for strategic gain. The difference was, now they were choosing it, with open eyes, to preserve a sliver of agency. The decision was made in that silent, fluorescent-lit room. Not with a nod, but with the slow, deliberate destruction of the most recent, unsent message to Brewer. They were stepping off the cliff together. The following Sunday, Irina went to her park bench. The copy of Byron was in her hands. She read, waiting. She knew Pierce would be watching. She let her posture, always so controlled, show a hint of defeat, a slight slump of the shoulders, a hand passing over tired eyes. She made herself look like a person carrying an unbearable burden. Pierce, observing from the surveillance van, saw it. He saw the crack. It was time. He left the van, alone. He walked into the park, a man on a stroll, and sat down on the far end of her bench, leaving a careful space between them. He did not look at her. He spoke to the air in front of him, his voice low and calm. "The poetry is a nice touch," he said, "but it doesn't match the eyes. Your eyes look like you've been reading casualty reports." Irina did not startle. She turned a page. "Lord Byron understood tragedy, Agent Pierce. It is not exclusive to war." The use of his name was her first card, establishing knowledge. Pierce felt a jolt, but kept his composure. "Your friend, the doctor in Baltimore, his sister took a turn for the worse last night. The clinic is requesting immediate payment. He's desperate." It was a lie, a probe. Irina's breath hitched, a perfectly calculated micro-reaction of genuine shock. Not at the sister's health, but at Pierce's knowledge of the leverage point. "What do you want?" she whispered, finally looking at him. "I want to understand the game," Pierce said, turning now to meet her gaze. His eyes were sharp, analytical, but not cruel. "I know about the broker. I know about the park dead drop. I know Volkov met with ghosts in Rock Creek. I am building a box around you both, and the walls are getting thicker every day. When I close it, it will crush you, and you will be sent back to Moscow, where I suspect the welcome for failed operatives is unforgiving." He was offering not kindness, but a clinical assessment of doom. It was more effective than any threat. "What is your alternative?" Irina asked, playing the trapped animal, considering a new cage. "A partnership," Pierce said. "You give me Dr. Brewer. You give me the mechanics of the network. In return, I don't close the box. I leave a door open in it. For you, for him. You become my window into what happens next, after this chapter closes. You save yourselves from your own people and from me." It was, in essence, exactly the deal she and Volkov had conceived. The chilling synchronicity confirmed they had read their enemy perfectly. The dance was now a tango. Irina let a long moment of conflicted silence hang in the air. Then, as if a string had been cut, she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "There is a hollow rock at the base of the pin oak near the fountain in Baltimore's Mount Vernon Park. The next pickup for the doctor's information is scheduled for Thursday after dark." She then closed her book, stood, and walked away without another word, leaving Pierce with the first tangible piece of the puzzle, handed to him by the very ghost he was chasing. When she returned to the embassy and reported the contact to Volkov, the atmosphere was funereal. They had crossed the Rubicon. They had initiated the sacrifice of Brewer to save their own skins, and in their twisted logic, the potential for a future they could control. Volkov pulled her into an embrace, not of passion, but of shared desolation. They were no longer just lovers or partners. They were co-conspirators, in a betrayal so vast it encompassed their asset, their service, and their new enemy. They had sold a piece of their souls to Pierce to keep the rest from being devoured by Moscow. The plan was in motion. There was no going back. The unthinkable equation had been solved, and the answer left them standing in a moral vacuum, holding on to each other as the only solid thing in a universe of shifting, treacherous mirrors. The final move was now Volkov's to make, and it had to be flawless. The 48 hours after Irina's park bench meeting were a masterclass in sustained, controlled terror. Every tick of the clock was a hammerfall. Volkov and Irina moved through the embassy like synchronized ghosts, their communication reduced to glances and prearranged touches. They prepared for the endgame, knowing it could culminate in triumph, capture, or a bullet from either side. The plan was a house of cards in a hurricane, and they were two of the cards, trembling at the center. Volkov's role was the most dangerous. He had to make the final dead drop to Brewer, the one that would contain the fabricated urgent requirement for the facility location, the bait for the FBI trap. But he also had to embed within it a silent, personal warning only Brewer might understand, a final pathetic attempt to salve his own conscience. Using an old code based on chemical symbols, he crafted a sentence that read, in essence, "The medicine is a lie. Your sister's hope is elsewhere. Save yourself." It was a reckless gesture, a tiny flare of humanity that could blow the entire operation if decoded by Pierce's men. But Volkov could not send the man to his doom without at least throwing him a rope, even if the rope was frayed and short. The night of the drop was moonless, the sky over Baltimore a blanket of wet, black wool. Volkov, using every counter-surveillance trick in his arsenal, false starts, subway reversals, a borrowed delivery van, shook the FBI tail he knew would be there. He moved through the sleeping city like a phantom, a shadow among shadows. He reached Mount Vernon Park, a landscape of looming statues and deep, ominous shadows. The pin oak by the fountain was a stark silhouette against the lesser dark of the sky. His senses, honed to a razor's edge, screamed. The park was too quiet. The normal sounds of night, rustling animals, distant traffic, were absent, swallowed by a thick, listening silence. He saw no one, but he felt them. Pierce was here. The box was closing, just not around him as planned, but around the drop point. He had to commit. He moved to the base of the tree, his fingers finding the familiar cool hollow of the rock. He swapped the encoded message for the one Brewer had left, a last set of metallurgical notes. As his hand left the crevice, a spotlight from a parked car on the distant street swept across the park, not directly on him, but illuminating the fountain in a stark, white glare for a second, before dying. A signal, a reminder. We are here. Volkov melted back into the darkness, his exit as meticulously planned as his entry. He was a ghost, returning to its haunt. The trap was set. The bait was in place. Now they waited. They waited in the soundproof room, not speaking, the tension, a physical wire drawn, taut between them. They imagined the scene. Pierce's men, hidden in the bushes, in the unmarked vans, watching the rock. Dr. Brewer, a shattered man drawn back to the source of his false hope, reaching in, the snap of handcuffs, the collapse of a life. The call from the embassy guard came at 3:17 in the morning. A disturbance at the gates. American authorities. For him. Volkov's hand went instinctively to his lapel, his fingertips brushing the reinforced fabric where the glass ampule lay sleeping. He looked at Irina. Her face was a mask of pale stone, but her eyes held his with a fierce, unyielding loyalty. This was the moment. The plan had called for his possible detention, a brief diplomatic storm. But the feeling was wrong. The timing was off. He walked down the grand staircase of the embassy towards the main doors, his footsteps echoing in the marble hall. He expected to see Pierce, smug with his trophy arrest of Brewer, here to gloat or to begin the delicate dance of their arrangement. What he saw through the glass doors froze the blood in his veins. It was not Pierce. It was two men in dark, ill-fitting suits, their faces Slavic planes of impersonal authority. They stood flanking a black car with diplomatic plates, but not Soviet ones. Czechoslovakian. A cover. And between them, her arms held, not with brutality, but with an inescapable institutional firmness, was Irina. She was coatless, her face turned towards the embassy, her eyes wide, searching the lighted windows. She saw him on the stairs. Her mouth opened, not to scream, but to form a single, silent word. Run. It was not the FBI, it was the center. They had been playing a deeper game. They had seen through the park bench meeting, or they had never trusted the false defection test, or Pierce had been clumsier than they thought. They were extracting her, liquidating the compromised element. And they were doing it from under the FBI's nose, using a third country cover, a brutal, elegant move that left no American legal recourse. Pierce's gray Chevrolet screeched to a halt behind the Czech car, doors flying open. Pierce erupted from it, his face a fury of betrayed understanding. He had been outmaneuvered. His precious asset, his window into Volkov, was being stolen from his grasp by the very people he was hunting. He shouted, brandishing his badge, but the two men merely produced their own diplomatic credentials, a wall of bureaucratic ice. This was a diplomatic eviction, not an arrest. Irina was being taken home. Volkov stood paralyzed behind the embassy glass, a prisoner in his own fortress. The diplomatic immunity that protected him now caged him. He could not step outside. He could not intervene. To do so would be to confess everything, to spark an international incident. He would lose. He was forced to watch. As Irina was guided into the back seat of the black car, she twisted her head, her gaze locking with his one final time. There was no fear in her eyes now, only a vast, terrible sorrow, and a final, unmistakable message of warning. Then the door closed. Swallowing her, the car pulled away, sliding past Pierce, who stood helpless in the street, his fists clenched, his grand design in ashes. He turned his blazing eyes towards the embassy, towards Volkov's silhouette in the lit doorway. Their eyes met across the no-man's land of the driveway. In Pierce's look was no victory, only a promise of relentless, personal war. The black car turned a corner and vanished. Volkov remained standing there long after the taillights had disappeared, long after Pierce had driven away in a fury of impotence. The night air seeping through the doors was cold, but it was nothing compared to the absolute zero now settling in his core. He had played the game against two masters, and in trying to outwit them both, he had lost the only real thing he had gained in the Shadow War. Slowly, mechanically, he turned and climbed the stairs back to the soundproof room. It was empty. Her scent still lingered. The volume of Byron lay on the table. He sat in her chair. He looked at the now useless schematics, the maps, the codes. It was all ash. His fingers went again to his lapel. This time they did not just brush the fabric. They dipped inside, finding the secret clasp. He withdrew the small amber glass ampule. He held it up to the weak light of the single bulb, watching the dense liquid within swirl, a tiny universe of finality. This was the exit, the clean end, the ultimate control. He thought of Irina in the hold of a ship, or in the back of a plane heading east. He thought of the welcome she would receive. He thought of Brewer, broken in an FBI interrogation room. He thought of Pierce, forever his shadow. He placed the ampule on the table next to the book of poetry. It sat there, a stark, terrifying, full stop. But it was not the end. Not yet. To take it now would be to accept their victory. Moscow's, Pierce's, the wars. It would be to let the machine grind her alone. He had promised to walk to the edge of the cliff with her. She had been taken over the edge. His duty now was not to jump after her, but to find a way down to where she had fallen. A new, more terrifying resolve crystallized within him, colder and harder than any before. The game was not over. It had simply entered its final, most desperate phase. He was no longer a spy gathering secrets. He was a weapon with a single personal target, the system that had taken her. Enormaz, Pierce, Moscow, they were all just obstacles now. The mission had collapsed into a singular driving purpose. He picked up the ampule and slipped it back into its cradle in the lapel. It was not his exit. It was his promise. A promise of what he would do if he failed. He reached out and gently closed the cover of the Book of Byron. Then he extinguished the lamp, plunging the room, and the man within it, into a darkness that was no longer empty, but filled with a silent, raging fire. The ghost had a purpose, and the world, dreaming of peace, had no idea what was now moving, alone and unforgiving, in its depths.